This Fed Gov Today program is sponsored by Maximus. On this edition of Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose, the end result of the data revolution for the whole federal government.
The killer app over the last 5+ years with Evidence Act 6 years has really been policy analysis and operational decision support, right? Being relevant at the speed of decision-making for agency leaders.
Former federal government data leader Kshmendra Paul on Fed Gov Today in just a moment. Uniting program strategy, advanced technology, process, and execution for a more efficient government. That's Maximus. Every program, every service, every time. That's innovation forward. Learn more at maximus.com/federal. Data.gov lists more than 310,000 data sets the federal government's opened for people to use. Data.gov celebrating its 16th year as the repository for federal data. Kshmendra Paul's former Assistant Inspector General for Cybersecurity Assessments and Data Analytics in the Office of the Inspector General at the Department of Energy, former Chief Data Officer at the Department of Veterans Affairs, and former Program Manager of the Information Sharing Environment. Kshmendra, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. You said something a moment ago before we turned the recorder on that I think is really a good observation. You were interested in data in the federal government space before data was cool. What's your historic view of where the government has come from in using data, the proficiency level that you think that agencies have achieved with using data, and how that informs the way that you see people using data moving forward? Welcome, Kshmendra.
Francis, thank you for having me on the show, and it's great to reconnect. We go back a ways, and it's fun to come together here. The government from a statutory and policy perspective has always featured data, information, data sharing, use of data to improve operations. It goes back to Klinger-Cohen with its focus on information resources management. Folks forget, right? But it used to be IRM, and it became CIOs, then it became with FITARA, much more of a focus on acquisition and cybersecurity. So there's been a lot of good government reform type efforts on data information, but there's also been a lot of slippage between the law and policy, and in particular between policy and agency implementation, right? I reflect back, and when I came in, like a lot of folks post 9/11, wanting to be a part of the solution, feeling that call of service, I came into the Department of Justice, and I was given the role of competitively selected into the chief enterprise architect role. And at the time, coming out of the private sector, I saw this as akin to product management of strategy. And, over the years, enterprise architecture has gotten a little bit discredited, but that wasn't my experience. I found that, where EA has failed, it was because it was treated as a CIO thing or an IT thing, not an enterprise transformation thing. Luckily, and maybe that's the wrong way to say it, given the tragic events of 9/11, but when I came in, there was a real demand pull from the Congress, the administration, program leaders, key stakeholders to, improve, to get better at using data and information sharing. So, and that's been a through line with my federal career. It's kind of been fun for me in different settings to really always come back to the focus on data, information sharing, transparency, and using data and information to make government more efficient, effective, to prevent fraud and things like that.
You and I met when you were at the information sharing environment at DHS, and I was at Federal News Radio. And you wrote a note about a couple of your stops in preparation for this conversation, Kshmendra. And about the ISE, you wrote that was a master class in public choice theory. What do you mean by that term?
Well, public choice theory is established in economics. It talks about how public agencies act in their own interest, which is sometimes different than the public good or mission equities. And, with the ISE, the information sharing environment, it was across sectors of government, Homeland Security, law enforcement, defense, foreign affairs, et cetera. Across levels of government, federal, state, local, tribal, territorial, with international partners. There's a lot of agencies that have to do things to make that work back then that was against their nature. They had to subordinate their agency equities for a common common good kind of thing, right? A state partner of mine, a leader in the ISE, used to lament to me every time he came to Washington, he had to make 25 stops. And every one of those stops, he got the message with that agency spin, right? State and local equities, how do they come into the national policy process? Well, they do wash through FBI, DHS, the intelligence community. Every agency has their own take on what they want out of state and local partners, CBP, ICE, so on and so forth. Well, the state and locals, they don't really want that. They wanted their voice in national policy unadulterated by agency equities. That was the master class, right? Is how do you do that? These are very powerful agencies and bureaucracies, right? And so again, there still was a lot of energy around post 9/11 reforms when I was, had the honor to be designated by the president, and I was in that job for 6 years. And when I came into it, I'm an IT guy, I'm a data guy. I'm not a law enforcement guy. I'm not a counterterrorism guy. They picked me because it was part of my portfolio at OMB when I was the federal chief architect, and I had an interest in it because of my time at DOJ. And I raised my hand, and I had the expertise. And so the original policy prescription was, well, maybe we devolve some of the partner engagement stuff to DHS and DOJ, FBI, and kind of take the information sharing bits of the ISE and partner up with the federal chief architect role and have that government-wide focus on information sharing. That didn't work out. And so I went over to the ISE, and, I ended up leaning into the partner engagement bits, even though that's not my traditional background, because that's where the need was.
What did you learn from that herding cats experience? And you write it this way: how to get agencies to do things that are suboptimal for them. What'd you learn from that experience that you took to VA and applied to where they were with data management when you got there?
Yeah, by the time I got to VA, and I think you remarked on this, earlier, the data now is all the rage, right? And this is being driven by technology, the marketplace, leading practices. They used to call it big data, creating data lakes and the rest. And Evidence Act is the statutory framework, and there's been guidance. Trump 45 put out the federal data strategy and some other guidance around implementing Evidence Act. A little bit of guidance came out under Biden. So when I was at VA, kind of an interesting kind of confluence happened where I was leading strategy, policy, governance across the entire agency. But I also, because of COVID and the Undersecretary for Health's need for quality data as he was managing this emergency, he was having 2-a-day, 3-a-day sessions with his network leaders from across the country. And every second meeting, every third meeting would devolve into an argument over whose PowerPoint was correct. When you talked about basic things like beds and veterans and where they were in their journey with COVID and how many ventilators we had. And he said, no, there's got to be a better way. So he partnered with my leadership to do a sole source with a technology vendor. I wasn't involved in that procurement decision, but they came to me to be the executive implementing the technology. So, I led the build out of a common operating picture, an integrated enterprise data model, populated by about 1,000 data sets, about 18,000 transformations, before I left. Basically a digital twin of the VA ecosystem, veteran facing and business, right? And so the big difference was, you had that ability to build that sort of technology, that sort of infrastructure, where that didn't exist when we did the NEAM, 20 years ago now. Now, what made it work was not just the technology, it's that we married it up with strong governance and policy to, guardrails. I'm a big believer in guardrails. Guardrails keep you safe. Guardrails allow you to drive fast, and have sustainable solutions. And we had effective guardrails to where folks believed in it. It was auditable, and we could implement this model of integrate once, curate once, reuse in a governed way many times. This single source of truth. And one application, they saved $90 million in 6 months on using best-in-class acquisition vehicles. And then PACT Act implementation. This was key support for tailored, potential benefit offerings for veterans that span both VA and VHA.
What are the opportunities that you see for agencies to use data better or maximize the ways that they're using data now to get better outcomes, either internally or externally, as you just referred to?
Yeah. So when I was at the Department of Energy Inspector General, I led oversight over the use of technology, cybersecurity, data analytics, artificial intelligence across all of the department's programs and operations. And I led build out of a organic data analytic capability to improve the IG's understanding of risk and, to accelerate audits, inspections, investigations, and things like that. So, I saw that there was, I think an underappreciation across government for oversight and connecting the dots across oversight. There's a tremendous output from IGs across the government, from GAO, and really individual programs look at those reports and they treat it as compliance activities. And I got to get better. I got to, do what's the minimum to get out of the recommendation and get out from underneath the oversight, rather than asking the question, hey, what's the root cause of these failures? Can I look across multiple reports and dig a little deeper and make systemic change? And so that struck me like a ton of bricks. And I was able to sort of combine my learnings as an IG and my understanding of, data and information and government reform, government operations. And I put it together into an advocacy piece, when I was active last December, right? I was still an active serving SES, and I had to go through the ethics process, but I wrote a piece which says, entitled "Government Reform Starts with Data and Evidence." I published it in Federal News Network, your old
platform. Stomping grounds, that's right.
Yeah, and it's heavily referenced and footnoted. It's a good read. I in that paper, I was able to really synthesize the opportunity for a government-wide common operating picture, right? Based on some of my past experiences, thinking about, I was in OMB, which during what I think of as one of their finest hours, which was the leadership of OMB during the transition from Bush to Obama around Recovery Act implementation, right? And giving OMB product responsibility, something that they really avoid because of the risk associated with product delivery and not wanting to do agencies' jobs. But in this case, incoming president-elect, and then President, Obama said, no, I want OMB out in front on Recovery Act implementation. And then, Earl Devaney, the IG, took the lead when there was a confirmation hiccup with the DDM. But that whole process avoided, by Earl's calculation, I believe, about 10 billion, that's billion with a B, 10 billion in expected fraud and probably another 15 billion in waste and abuse. It's an amazing outcome when you think about it. And you compare that to Recovery Act, right, where you didn't have the tone at the top. You didn't have the proactive focus on data analytics, and basic controls weren't implemented. And, it was wild kingdom times for the fraudsters.
I'm going to put you back in the chair at OMB, and I'm going to give you the opportunity to update the federal data strategy. What would you like to see the agencies doing, and how would you like to see them, and how would you like to see OMB measuring it so that agencies do maximize the way that they're using data?
So that's a great question, and a few things. One is I do think OMB should designate a federal chief data analytics officer. This is reflecting on the seam between OIRA and their information policy responsibilities and the federal CIO, who used to be the Office of eGov and IT, right, and their information technology responsibilities. But who's on first when it comes to using data to improve government operations? Second, Evidence Act focuses on program evaluation. A great thing. It talks about the federal statistical community. Great thing. But the killer app over the last 5+ years with Evidence Act, 6 years, has really been policy analysis and operational decision support, right? Being relevant at the speed of decision making for agency leaders. This is a sort of a sibling of policy evaluation, but policy evaluation looks out multiple years, right, and uses gold standard approaches to program evaluation as opposed to, good enough authoritative data and good enough analytics, but it's timely and useful in the moment for establishing policy and operating programs. I think, understanding that's not just me saying this, the Federal Chief Data Officers Council's put out some products, the Data Foundation, Nick Hart's put out some products, right? It's that, sort of data analytics is the killer app. Third, the federal CFO has had a focus on program integrity, right, using data analytics, but it's been policy-led and compliance-led as opposed to actual honest-to-goodness, capability. The current administration is, kind of pushing forward capability, but without perhaps the focus on guardrails and policy that, perhaps my background sort of, kind of emphasized. I think if you bring those things together, there's an opportunity to, sort of really kind of get rid of that slippage that we talked about earlier and push forward.
Is the role of a federal chief data analytics officer different than the role of a federal chief data officer?
Yes, because it emphasizes sort of product responsibility, right? A chief data analytics officer is focused on owning use cases around using data and analytic models. And I've talked about, the focal point is operational management, kind of, and a great way to do this would be to tie it to the president's management agenda, right? A PMA comes out. What's the instrumentation? Is there mud on the windshield or do you have an instrument panel and can you see the road in front of you as you're driving? You need data. You need authoritative data. You need immutable, records of decisions so that, when you look at programs quarter over quarter, year over year, you have a sense that you're making forward motion or not.
It's great to talk to you, my friend. There's a lot more we could cover and we're out of time, but I'd love having you on the show, my friend.
Francis, it's great to be with you. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts.
You can read more about data in government on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. The director of the Defense Information Systems Agency has a 4-pronged priority list to guide his agency. You'll learn about all 4 priorities from Lieutenant General Paul Stanton on Fed Gov Today TV this Sunday morning at 10:30 on ABC7 in Washington and on the Fed Gov Today YouTube channel. If you miss the debut of the show, you can watch it on demand anytime at fedgovtoday.com and on YouTube. The Thrift Savings Plan's mobile app is more popular than ever. You'll learn why and what people are using it for on the next Fed Gov Today podcast. You can listen to every Fed Gov Today podcast anytime you want on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on demand at fedgovtoday.com. I'm Francis Rose. Thanks very much for listening.